The next session is from the MacArthur Foundation called Policing Reform is Not Enough, the Importance of a Systems Approach. For that, please welcome Michael Jacobson. He's the Executive Director of the Institute for State and Local Governance at the City University of New York, and here to lead the conversation is Laurie Garduque. She's Director of Justice Reform at the MacArthur Foundation.
Thank you, Margaret. Good afternoon, everyone. We're delighted to partner with the Atlantic on bringing this event to St. Louis. St. Louis is one of our partners, and the Safety and Justice Challenge. Michael and I are going to expand and build on the previous conversation. The Safety and Justice Challenge is MacArthur's initiative to change the way America thinks about and uses jails, which was certainly part of the conversation here today. While Margaret mentioned Michael's current position as the head of the Institute for State and Local Governance at the City University of New York, I also want to point out he was president of the Vera Institute of Justice. He also previously served as the New York City Corrections Commissioner, the New York Probation Commissioner, and was also professor at John Jay College in New York. So we've heard a lot about the issues in terms of the people who are needlessly incarcerated in jails. We've heard a little bit about the need for policing reform, the importance of police-community relations, the importance of having community at the table and holding the system accountable. But I want to bring us back to thinking about reform and what approach would be most effective in assuring confidence in our justice system, its legitimacy, restoring the public trust, and why focusing on single elements of the system might not work.
Sure. Well, focusing on police, obviously, there's a huge focus nationally, locally. It makes sense for a million reasons, but you can't reform a criminal justice system just by reforming police. It's hugely necessary, but it's not a sufficient condition to reform a whole system. And I say that because even if you had the fairest, most effective, most legitimate policing you could have, you still have a sort of beast of a system behind that, with incredible sort of sorting. Who are prosecutors charging? How are they charging them? Who are they declining to prosecute? What kind of plea offers are they making? Who's winding up in jail? Why are they winding up in jail? Are they winding up in jail for lack of money? What are the jail conditions like? How do they wind up in prison? It's more likely you'll be in prison if you're in jail. There's a million sort of data points like that, all of which are hugely important. So if you're going to reform the system, you have to look at the whole system, and certainly the parts of the system that follow policing.
Right. So you're implicating then not only law enforcement, but courts and corrections. Many of those officials are elected, and what we're trying to change then is their discretion. So looking at jails, why do you think we should focus on jails? Why is that a good way of looking at the outcomes of the justice system?
Right, so one of the most important determinants of what happens to people during their pendency in the criminal justice system is A, whether they go to jail or not. Jail is, I ran jails, right? It's a very sort of harmful, punitive place to be. So you want to use it incredibly parsimoniously. The only people who should be in jail pre-trial are people who pose a risk to the community or are a risk to not appear. That's it. No one else should ever be in jail other than for those two things. And so when you do go to jail and you stay there unnecessary lengths of time to get your case decided, several things happen. It has all sorts of implications for your life, your home life, your school, your work. And then there's a ton of research that shows that the longer you're in jail, the more likely you are to be sentenced to prison compared to people who have been arrested for the same things but are not in jail. So it has a huge impact. And jail itself has a huge impact. Even the best run jails in the world make you crazy, right? So you only want to be there as quickly as you can. The object of any jail is to get you in and out safely, humanely, and quickly to wherever you're going to go. State prison, back to the community. No one should be in jail for any length of time as a pretrial detainee.
So we've heard a lot more focused across the country on sentencing reform, prison reform, as drivers of mass incarceration. Can you give me a sense of how jails factor into this picture, sort of the scale and dimensions of jail admissions, how much they cost? I think that sometimes we blur the lines, and there are some important differences to keep in mind.
Sure. Well, and people are obviously familiar with the sort of term and details of mass incarceration. I think it's important to remember when you talk about mass incarceration, I mean, people tend to focus on the prison population and our hugely high rates of incarceration in prison, all of which are true. This state has a 25% higher incarceration rate than the rest of the country, which already has the highest incarceration rate in the world, although the state is not unusual in that regard. But the real experience with incarceration for Americans is jail, right? Almost 12 million people go into jail a year, right? Most of them don't go to prison. They can be in jail for 1 day, 3 days, 5 days, 9 months. And again, as I said, jail it rarely makes you better, right? The goal is for it not to make you worse and for you not to stay there for a long time. And again, it has all sorts of harmful collateral effects on people and communities, so you want to use it carefully. There are a lot of jails around the country where jail conditions are really awful. And all of that has sort of additive impact on people, not just people's health and mental health and livelihoods. But again, as I said, one of the reasons we have so many people in prison and lead the world in rates of prison is that we have so many people in jail. And just by being in jail, for whatever it is, sort of whether it's implicit bias or just the way decisions are made, the more people you have in jail, the more people you will have in prison. And we know this, we put people in jail who do not have to be in jail, right? Especially for pretrial. If you're accused of a crime, but you pose no threat to public safety, and the courts are convinced you will come back, then you should be out awaiting your trial. We sort of default to keeping people in jail because it's safe politically. And we get what we get. When you have 12 million people cycling in and out of jail, you're going to have 1.4 million people in state prisons, which we have.
So we're referring to a problem then, as I understand it, of both over-criminalizing and over-punishing people's behavior. And it falls disproportionately on low-income people and communities of color. And we're also dealing with decisions that are made with law enforcement, courts, and corrections where there's a great deal of discretion exercised, which is harder to change by the rule of law. So what do you think the outlook is for making systems changes when you have independently elected judges, or at least where I come from in Illinois, independently elected state's attorneys or DAs, independently elected sheriffs. The mayor is elected and appoints the police chief. Is there any reason to believe that you can get alignment to achieve systems change?
It's a really good question, and it's obviously difficult. And I actually am sort of optimistic that there is. I mean, I think the key is sort of transparency. The reason why people know a lot about the police is that they're on the street. You can see police, right? They're the most sort of obvious manifestation of law enforcement. When you get into the world of especially prosecutors, right, prosecutors are probably the least transparent of all the agencies in the system, and also arguably the most powerful, important. How they make decisions, what cases they don't go forward with, what they do, what kind of plea offers they forward, how long it takes for them to process cases. All of these are hugely important decision points, and they have their same sorts of points in every part of the system. So the more we know about them, the more those are obvious to people, the more you can debate them, the more you can ask, why does that prosecutor in this county decline to prosecute 30% of the cases and this one 5%? The same ones are coming in, right? You have to know that to have that conversation. But my experience is if you know that, if you have that conversation, things can change, right? And they can change because number of them are elected officials, right? So they are responsive to people when they know stuff, you know? So just to use a local example, I think more or less in St. Louis County, I think about a quarter of the population is African American, probably about 50%. So twice that are municipal defendants, and then it gets worse as you go into prison. All that just doesn't happen by magic. Those are all discretion points along the way, some very inside baseball, sort of mundane, in the weeds, and you have to sort of get that information, put it out there, and let people react to it. And I think you can start to have alignment if that happens.
Well, I know that the MacArthur Foundation is optimistic about the possibilities of change at the front end of the system, and that when we issued the RFP, the request for proposals for the Safety and Justice Challenge, we had 191 jurisdictions from 45 states, and we were very pleased and excited to see St. Louis County make the commitment to changing the way they use their jails, reduce racial and ethnic disparities, and tackle the problem of the misuse and overuse of jails. So will you all thank me for Michael imparting his wisdom about how to make a difference in this world?
I will say thank you, Michael, and thank you, Laurie, and thank you again for making this conversation here today possible.